Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to our conference on Antidotes to Islamist Terrorism. I understand one or two people are still coming in, but I think we should get started. First of all, I'm delighted to see you all here, and thank you for coming. I don't need to underline the importance of the topic that we're discussing today. Can I first of all say a few words of thanks, not least to Matty Heaven, who is sitting on my left here, who I have to say was the original inspiration for this conference, and Matty will be talking to you in a moment. But first of all, I think we have to understand the depth of the problem that we're dealing with. There are, of course, conventional conflicts and insurgencies in many parts of the world, and it's civilian populations which tend to be the most affected. But it is terrorism now which has become a global phenomenon, and in 2015 there were over 11,000 recorded terrorist attacks around the world in some 92 countries. So we're not by any means just thinking in terms of these countries here in Western Europe, although inevitably that's much of our focus today. In the past year there have been at least 9 attacks claimed by Daesh, including of course the Paris Champs-Élysées shooting, the bombings in Brussels, which claimed 32 lives, and 4 of the lone wolf-style truck or car attacks in Stockholm, in Westminster, London, Berlin, and Nice. I mean, it doesn't need to be said, but I shall say it, that clearly not all terrorism is Islamist. But since the 1980s, at least, Islamist-inspired terrorism has become the main threat, certainly, to the security of our Western liberal democracies. Now, I would say the greatest medium-term threat to our security comes from a nexus of jihadist terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But the most immediate threat is clearly from ad hoc terrorist attacks. David Anderson, QC, very distinguished lawyer in the United Kingdom and the former reviewer of terrorism legislation in the UK, observed that the lure of Daesh may be on the wane, but its legacy remains in the shape of hardened terrorist fighters, some of them already back in Europe. Now, I have to say, when we originally conceived this conference, we intended to use a subheading. The subheading was, how do we save young immigrants from Muslim countries from the vice of extremism and give them the freedom we imagine they're looking for? Our motivation there was that we felt that so many people came to our countries and far from escaping what they'd left behind, they got to our countries and found that often it was worse, that they came in the grip of extremist elements within a community where they were now living. And so in a way there was no escape from what they thought they'd left behind, and often it was even worse. But we dropped that subheading because we felt that it was too exclusive and didn't pay sufficient attention to the fact that most of the terrorists, certainly in the UK, are homegrown. And we'll talk more about that during the course of the day. Well, the aim of the conference is obviously to improve our understanding of this very difficult and dangerous issue, but above all to identify fresh ideas to help us overcome the problem. And I'm delighted that we have such an excellent range of speakers from Belgium, from Germany, from Egypt, from Italy, and from the United Kingdom. and we'll introduce them in the course of the conference. I have to say that there are a couple of speakers who should have been coming and at the last moment have had to drop out. One is Kyle Orton from the Henry Jackson Society, and the other is Ed Hussein, who was going to speak this afternoon. However, we have an additional speaker who I'll introduce in a moment. But let me just turn, first of all, to Matty Heaven, who is our co-organiser. Matty.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you for everybody to be here today in this such an important and critical issue that we're all facing in the world. And thank you for hosting this event, Geoffrey. So really appreciate that. So the aim, as Geoffrey said, our intention is for today's event is to work together to resolve this growing problem of Islamist radicalisation. So when we talk about terrorism, we need to find out what happens when someone becomes a terrorist. So it's a process. So that's why we kind of chose the title of extremism and radicalisation, because that's the starting point of someone then to move to become a terrorist. And we would like to find out where and why and the roots of the problem. No one has really gone into analysing where does radicalisation comes from, where does extremism comes from. A lot of conversation is all about when an event happens, how do we deal with the situation? How do we deal with the terrorist attacks? But what we want to look into much deeper, looking at the root, and one of the things that comes into mind, people questioning with Islamist radicalisation, is about Quran. We need to understand the teachings that says in the Quran, and today's event we're going to open this subject. Does it promote extremism? Does it promote radicalisation in the text of the Quran? So we will be looking into that aspect today in one of the panels. Your contribution and your attendance is very important for everybody to be here, and towards the end of the day we would like to come up with some conclusion and some kind of moving forward to make some changes and solutions and actually follow up this event. So it would be in 6 months' time we will review where we go from here. Okay? So thank you very much, and I'm going to thank Geoffrey again for introducing the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matty. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we could start. Let me say, first of all, that we want this to be very interactive because our speakers will give their views, but then I hope you will have questions, or indeed you will have comments that will contribute to our discussion and to our understanding. And if you do have a question, by the way, I would ask that you sort of identify yourselves and just say who you are, if you represent an organisation or whatever. But I'm honoured and delighted this morning that we have as our keynote speaker Gilles de Kerchove. Now, many of you, of course, don't need to be introduced to Mr. de Kerchove. He's been the European Union Counter-Terrorism Coordinator since 2007. So it's a decade in the job. He coordinates the work of the European Union in the field of counter-terrorism, maintains an overview of the instruments at the Union's disposal, and monitors the implementation of EU counter-terrorism strategy. I've said to him this morning, I hope he's going to talk to us about terrorism and not about the EU. I think the great thing from your point of view, Gilles, is that you have an overview of the situation. Probably an unrivaled overview, given your position. So, Gilles de Kerchove, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for your kind words, Geoffrey, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing and hosting this event. I think we need more of that, and I like your title, Antidotes to Islamist Radicalisation. It is indeed a poison. You have been giving me 5 to 10 minutes, so for a tricky issue like this one, it's a challenge. Maybe 3 points. One quick word on the development of the threat, one on this process of radicalization drives, you said the roots. The diplomat in New York don't like that we mention root or root causes, but that's what it is all about. And finally, not what the EU does, I'm still trying to convince the system to do more, but what we need to do more in telegraphic terms. On the threat, you summarize extremely well. When one sees last month's number of events, most of the time these are not lone wolf, but that's lone actors. There may be some prepositioned cell of Daesh waiting for the right moment to strike, but most of what we will see in the short term, I do agree we have to be worried by more sophisticated attack with catastrophic consequences in the medium run, because it's no easy for an individual person to get access to high tech, which multiply the impact. But for the short term, it's a lot of people frustrated because they've not been able to undertake the jihad because it's no longer possible. Vulnerable people like refugees, people who just get radicalized on internet, and mentally ill people, copycat phenomenon. We know it's, by the way, the strategy that was developed by al-Suri, more having 1,000 cuts than one of big 9/11 type attack. We've seen the growing role of internet, the growing link with crime. Most of them have a criminal past. The use of migration flow, which has the unfortunate consequence to feed a xenophobic debate, the growing number of women and of converts. So the process of radicalization, you've said that I've been for a decade in this position. I used to say, after 10 years, I still have difficulty to understand the process. I've reached a very simple conclusions that there might be 3 sets of drivers, and we have to work on the 3 sets of drivers. And it's very person-specific and country-specific, and it may be different from one person to another. But this being said, we have to address the 3. And I'm not sure we always address the 3 in an even manner. The first set, we know, it's in a more Marxist explanation, what explains sort of personal vulnerabilities, lack of a sense of purpose in life, a very difficult personal family history, problem of identity, failure of injustice, also sometimes a bit too much testosterone, a taste for violence, and the jihad venture give them all this, a sense of bondship, a sense of purpose, some self-recognition from zero to hero, and access to violence. But beside that, the second set is linked to the ideology, radical Islam. And on that front, we have to acknowledge we're a bit afraid to raise that aspect. But that it may play a role. I don't know if it's a key role, a central role, a main driver, but it plays a role. For Gilles Kepel, very early in the process of radicalization, for the French Olivier Roy at the end of the process, because it gives you a sort of black and white vision of the world and why you can use violence to push your ideas, but it plays a role. And if we deny that role, in a way, it has 2 consequences. The first one, we tell all these inside Islam who are fighting hard to get rid of the sect which spoiled their religion, that what they do is irrelevant. That it's because they live in Molenbeek, period. And the other unfortunate consequence is that it's, in a way, you leave the discourse to those who are providing the wrong answer, Marine Le Pen. So that's why I think we have to address that. And the third set of factors is what we call the facilitators, internet, prison, and active Salafi organization. If you look in Germany, I'm told that you see very active Salafi organization recruiting among the refugees, because they are more vulnerable. And in Belgium, if Belgium has the highest number in Europe, EU, of foreign terrorist fighters, it's because the first wave has been recruited in the street of Antwerp, Vilvoorde, Brussels by Sharia for Belgium, a Salafi organization. Internet played a role for the second wave, but for the first wave it was street recruitment. Third, what do we do in EU or collectively member states, and what do we don't do enough? I think understanding the phenomenon, we still need to keep on investing in research. That remains necessary. We we create a network among the field practitioners, and recently, rightly so, the German and the French asked the Commission to transform our radicalisation aware network. Very helpful, but we need more meetings among policymakers, and the Commission will come soon with an idea to upgrade a bit the brainstorming among policymakers. Internet, I think the Commission here, again, we've set up an interesting framework to discuss with the big Internet companies, but you need to put the pressure a bit. You may have seen 2 or 3 weeks ago an interesting development in the UK when big companies decided to stop financing the Internet platform because they were hosting xenophobic, supremacist speeches and so on. All of a sudden, on the other side, they said that they could do more. They could use artificial intelligence to be more to detect more quickly unacceptable or illegal, unlawful content. So rehabilitation, I think there, very few member states have an effective rehabilitation mechanism in prison or as an alternative to prison. We need quickly to invest much more on that. Not just to handle some of the returnees where it's a good idea to provide an alternative to prison, or because we won't have enough evidence to secure a conviction. And finally, I would say mainstream counter-violence extremism concern in different other policies which should not be seen or should be mainly driven by counter-violent extremism objective, but plays an important role: education, social policy, youth, culture, urban development. And finally, do we need to start a discussion on how to create the conditions for the development of I don't like the way to put it, European Islam, but to allow Islam to develop in a peaceful, transparent way in Europe, and not always be under the pressure of the jihadi development. This is something we haven't started discussing even, because we believe it's not for the EU, not for government to have that discussion. I tend to believe that we should. So in a way, and I stop here, where I see the need for more on internet, more on rehabilitation mechanism, more to mobilize other policies. I remember after Charlie Hebdo, the Minister of Education of the 28 met and decided a lot, but there is a lot we need now to implement to make it effective. And finally start a discussion on, as I said, European Islam, but it's not the right way to put it. Thank you very much.
Gilles, thank you very much for giving us your thoughts there. And I know Mr. Kerchove will be with us throughout this session, so there will be an opportunity to ask him questions after others have spoken. I mentioned to you that our speaker from the Henry Jackson Society was not going to be with us. I mean, in this first session, we really want to look at the extent and nature of the problem that we're talking about. And actually, I was very keen to get someone from the Henry Jackson Society because, as you may know, they very recently published an analysis of the 264 convictions in the United Kingdom for Islamist-inspired terrorist offences over the past 20 years. And they looked at each of the individuals and drew certain conclusions. And if I could just briefly mention, well, most of them were men, although there was female involvement. This has recently increased. and the women were usually acting in support of a family member. The mean terrorist age was 27. Well, we know, of course, that terrorists have ranged in age from 16 to 52, but the mean age was 27. 72% of those convicted were British nationals. Now, and we're talking about in the United Kingdom, by the way, but 72% of them were British nationals. Nearly half of them were born in the UK. Most of them had a South Asian ancestry, and most commonly, they weren't the majority, but more than any other category, they were British Pakistanis. So they were the, if you like, the predominant element there. The perpetrators were most likely to come from, and this was a very interesting part of the study, is that they identified where exactly in the United Kingdom people came from, where they lived. They were most likely to come from areas of higher than average Muslim density, and most came from a very small number of places. For example, 3 particular boroughs in London, Tower Hamlets, Newham and Waltham Forest, and 2 in Birmingham, Hall Green and Hodge Hill. And I think, by the way, the conclusion from that was the importance of this person-to-person infection, if you like, that there was this very local influence that one was seeing. Interestingly, they found little correlation between involvement in terrorism and education or employment status. So some of them had higher degrees and were professional people. Some had left school early. There was a whole range of educational background. Some were unemployed, some were in work, some were in quite high-paid professional occupations. About 16% were committed by converts, including 5 who'd been converted while in prison for other reasons. Over half of them were living at home. By that they meant either with a spouse or partner, or indeed with parents. 76% were previously known to the authorities, either because of some previous fringe involvement, perhaps in extremist activity, or indeed because of some other offence. And the most serious offences were conducted by individuals either under the direction of or inspired by a proscribed terrorist organisation. So that factor was there as well. So I think, okay, we're just looking at the United Kingdom, and by the way, the people that were convicted. I mean, there are a hell of a lot more out there who are planning and plotting, and a lot more on the fringe of extremist networks. But these were the ones that were convicted. So I think there were some interesting points that might help our discussion. But let me now turn to Cedric Schmitz, who has very kindly joined us. He is superintendent with the Belgian Federal Police, and he's head of their unit Information Management and chairman of the local task force against extremism and radicalism in Brussels. So, Cedric, perhaps we could, where are we? There he is. Perhaps we could ask you to give us a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. So before saying anything else, I must say that police is, I think, not the fittest institution to develop a thought about radicalism and extremism. We like to see ourselves more like a tool than a stakeholder. Anyhow, we were forced into it by the event, you mentioned them, and we like to see ourselves well trained to cope with crime and less comfortable with ideas. But dragged into the complex issue of radicalism and extremism by those events, we were asked to come up with a plan. And if I must say that the link you made between crime and radicalism and terrorism is for us a good link, as we see that in the past most of the people that were involved into actions, into terrorist actions, were before linked to small petty crimes like drug smuggling, drug sellings, small street crime. So we came up with a plan that's called the Canal Plan, because we, out of the actions that were taken in Paris, we saw that most of the people coming from these networks were out from a borough that was in the canal zone. So this plan, the fight against, it was meant to fight radicalism, violent extremism, and terrorism in the canal area. Let me start with this timeline. We first came up, the Home Office first came up with a plan against radicalism in the early years 2000, because it was already an issue, more far-right and extreme left people, but then came the Salafi and Wahhabi problems later during the years. And in the year 2015, before the attempt, the bombing of Paris, the Home Office came up with a plan creating a national task force on radicalism and local task force, one for each judicial district. One of the main issues that we were supposed to face with the local task force were the foreign terrorist fighters, the people that were planned to go abroad and do jihad in Syria. First it was in the Sahel region, then Syria, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan and Iraq. Then occurred the attack on Paris, you mentioned it, in November 2015, and we made a first diagnosis out of that attack. We realized that most of the people that were involved from Belgium came up from one specific borough, Molenbeek, and we realized that maybe we lost some ground there. We were not, the state was not enough on the ground there, on the field, in this specific borough. Then the attack on Brussels occurred, and then we were forced more and more into strengthening that diagnosis. We realized that we had to put a special effort on these geographical zone, the canal zone. This plan is very specific. If you know the Belgian institutions, you know that working between regions, working between different zones is not that easy. So we had a plan that goes on both two judicial districts, but 2 regions, 5 police districts, 8 different boroughs. We tried to start with a plan that had an approach on multi-level. First federal, Home Office and Justice, then local and federal police department. You all know that police in Belgium is divided on 2 levels. Both two King's Prosecutor's Office from both judicial districts that were involved, the mayors, and the region of Brussels. All that together is not, when you know Belgium, you know that it's not that easy to realize. The 4 strands of that plan were first prevention. As you said, an early detection of an issue might bring good results. Second was administration. We felt that the local boroughs and the region administration had to be involved, because some of the issues we faced were linked to the way these people, we didn't know exactly who lived where. We realized that some of the people that went abroad in the jihad zone still had unemployment wages, social wages, and etc. Then there's a police strand, the one I'm busy with, and then there's justice strand. The key factor is always working together. We try to implement a plan where all stakeholders would have his own strand linked to the other ones. On the police strength, as I said, we work on both levels, local and federal police, both judicial districts. We don't know boundaries, we don't stop to boundaries when it comes to judicial district. We try to avoid stigmatization of the population in general. We try to focus on foreign terrorist fighters, and since a few months now also on homegrown terrorist fighters. I think the words are not very good, well chosen, because for me, foreign terrorist fighters are also homegrown. But we decided we would use HTF, homegrown terrorist fighters, for the people that were not, they didn't plan to go abroad, but to stay here to make their actions here. We tried also to work on the recruiting and radicalizing agents to get the right target. Because if you make a general plan that goes and falls on everyone's shoulder, you might miss the target. We don't want the people living in those boroughs to think that we are targeting the old borough. We are trying to focus on the pertinent targets. We have tried to improve the processes because we realize that most of the process we use were standardized in Belgium, and they were not fit for these specific issues. We also strengthen the field presence because we think that the state has to go back, has to come back in those boroughs that where the feeling is that the state left these people alone. We tried to improve our information and intelligence position. All our actions were based on intelligence, and we tried to do a comprehensive and integrated approach all together, not just every strand on his own. And we worked on six axes. First of all, we tried to improve the flows and exchange of information between police services and departments, but also between the police and the local administration and the regional administration, and also the national administration. This exchange of information is the key for the success of this plan in the future. And the second axis is that we approach the targets with a multidisciplinary way. We tried to get an approach on every person that is involved from all sides, not only the police side, not only the justice side, but also through the prevention services and through the local administration. And as I said, we enforced the fight against the supporting criminal phenomenon, narcotics, as I said, weapons and forgery. These are supporting criminal phenomenon because, first of all, narcotics is a way to finance the trip to the region where these foreign terrorist fighters want to go, but also because we think that the trust between the members of a core, the members of a network, is based on their late experience as a as a drug dealers. Weapons, because of course, when you want to take action, I mean, here in Belgium, you need weapons, and we try to foresee and see what are the links between the networks for weapons, the trafficking weapons, and these cells, or lone wolves, and the forgery, because we think that most of them are using false documents, or to leave the country, or to come back, and that's going to be the next issue for us. It's the way they're going to come back through maybe immigrants' roads, or maybe just through regular roads with forged documents. We are trying to fight the illegal economy supporting terrorism, and that's involving a way of transferring money from Belgium to abroad. Awala and these parallel banking systems, but also the normal, I'd say, banking systems like Western Union and also other bank systems. We try to approach, I think we do it with some success, the phenomenon of radicalisation, and you have to know that according to Belgian law, radicalisation is not a crime. So the approach that we have to use against this phenomenon has to take that into account. So we cannot convict someone for being a radical only for this action. And of course we try to improve mutual support between both police level and police departments, but also with all the stakeholders in the other strands. If you have to remember something about police action, and it's not only valid, I think, for us in Belgium, is we try to work on facts more than on opinions. Police is not well trained, as I said, to cope with ideas. We are not philosophers. We are supposed to be crime fighters, and facts are the base of our work. And we always try to take experience into account with a certain limit. We all know the limits of the past experience because, and that's the third point, we do not want to foresee the future. We are not very good with provisions. It's not our job to see what tomorrow is going to be. We all know that if we only base our actions on the past, we won't be able to face the future. The best way for us to be the best police we can provide is on being ready to face anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very, very helpful. Gentlemen, could I turn now to Mr. Khalid Azmi? Mr. Azmi has kindly joined us from Cairo. We've focused very much at the moment on what's happening in Europe, but of course what happens in other countries is not only bears on some of our problems, but there are lessons to be learned there as well. Mr. Azmi is the director of the International Counter-Terrorism Unit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Cairo. He's been in that position since October 2015. He's got wide international experience. He's served in London, in Moscow, in Buenos Aires, and he studied originally in Canada. So, Mr. Azmi, we very much look forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really honored to be here. Let me start by talking about quick remarks on the situation we have in the Middle East. As you all know, 6 years ago, the dynamics that govern the Middle East for probably the last 6 decades have profoundly changed. A wave of large-scale societal change has swept the region and shocked it to its very core, launching at the same time a unique historical moment that is both promising and alarming. But what has transpired in the Middle East in the last 6 years in comparison to the previous 6 decades really is the unprecedented, almost complete breakdown in regional order. I mean, we used to have, apart from the Arab-Israeli conflict that has been a constant factor in the last 6 decades, we used to have one major crisis in one particular country every 10 years or so. Lebanon, I would argue, was the dominant one in the 70s. The Iran-Iraq war was the one in the 80s. And of course, in the 90s, with the invasion of Kuwait and the aftermath, was the dominant problem. And of course, Iraq in the 2000s. But when you have simultaneous crises in 5 or 6 countries at the same time, this is, in my opinion, almost unprecedented. From Libya to Tunisia, but of course Tunisia managed to pass through this, to Yemen, to Syria, to Iraq, and the situation also we faced in Egypt in post-2011 until we succeeded in overcoming some of the challenges we faced. So this is really unprecedented in many ways. Second remarks points to the fact that the lesson we can draw from what happened, one of the lessons, is that when you have a breakdown in the nation-state institutions, what you get is a big vacuum that is filled automatically by primitive groups, primordial groups, either sectarian or terrorist, or sometimes both in some cases. So you have this dynamic. So the betting is that the betting on that the breakdown of nation states in the Middle East is the way forward is a complete false and dangerous assessment. Actually, it's the other way around, is how do we preserve the nation states and at the same time work collaboratively in order to address some of the core issues of the problems. So we should talk about how to redraft what can be said in general terms of the social contract within the nation states, not through destruction of the nation states. The third point is that our mutual cooperation to combat and to counter terrorism is, as I repeatedly say to all my Western friends, is not a leisure by any means. It's an extremely essential element. The threat, we all face the threat one way or another. Nobody is immune. Underdeveloped societies, developing societies, advanced societies. This is a unique threat that we all face. So we need to come together as quick as possible and enhance our cooperation in this regard. The last, fourth point, Egypt repeatedly stresses the fact that you can't solve this problem by security measures alone. No way. You need to have as comprehensive as possible your tools. We need to address some of the social, economic, political issues that relates, that could be considered the roots of this problem, along with the security dimension, which is almost, of course, sometimes is essential to employ. I need to touch on how do we see the threat assessment in light of recent events. Let me point to a couple of points here. Daesh and Al-Qaeda, of course, with all their affiliates and branches and all of that, continue to conduct operations in our country and in all of our countries, actually, not only in Egypt. But fortunately enough, they have failed to achieve their strategic objectives. The recent weakness of Daesh in light of the operations being conducted against it in Syria and Iraq does not mean, in our opinion, that the threats we face are necessarily less, but have certainly changed, and we have to keep pace with that. We see affiliates of Al-Qaeda and Daesh operating sometimes free of central command. But the space created by weaker Daesh has been filled not only by its own operatives, affiliates, and branches, but also by a sort of array of other groups and self-starting entities, and sometimes lone wolves or small groups inspired by Daesh. So we see here important development in terms of the multiplying number of organizations or lone wolves or networks that are operating sometimes, as I said, independently from Daesh, inspiration by Al-Qaeda and the rest. And at the same time, we see that the hierarchies that once controlled them is becoming a little bit weaker. or dispersed at least. But one thing remains constant, actually, and sometimes I'm surprised that analysts and observers don't notice this constant factor, actually, not only recently in the last 5-6 years, but actually probably from the 70s onward, is that all of these entities are interacting together. They talk and are inspired by each other, and associates and combine forces in a way that cannot always be predicted. We have seen that most recently, for example, in Syria, in the Paris attack, where you have on-the-ground collaboration between elements that are supposedly Daesh and elements that are connected to Al-Qaeda. So, and I can go on and go on and tell examples going back, as I said, from the 70s. So they come together for specific operations. They get the same funding from they get funding from the same sources, and so, in my opinion, sometimes we easily just put boxes and we tick them, thinking that by this way we make sense of the threat, and give a coherence to a complicated phenomenon. But in my opinion, a threat assessment based around groups and organizations is often less accurate than the assessment based on movements and on the common ideology which cements them together. And challenging the ideology and the narrative that these groups depend on is vital. On this point, really, and I appreciate what Gilles has alluded to in reference to the ideology, we have to be less shy, seriously, as he said. I mean, we have to be more frank and more direct in pointing out how the ideology of Islamists, political Islamists, is not only a problem, of course, but is the core and the essence of what we have been seeing from these terrorist groups. And understanding the roots, where was this ideology formed, how and why has it been formed, is the number one element in trying to deciphering what is going on and how can we deal with that. We can go on more details later in the discussion, maybe in other sessions that touches on that, but going back to the roots of the Sayyid Qutb, the ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Maududi, the Indo-Pakistani theorist of the 1930s and 1940s, the founder of the Pakistani Jama'ah Islami, is essential. Without this reading of their texts, not the Quran and the Hadith, their founding texts of the Islamist, political Islamist ideology, we are not going anywhere. Last couple points on the challenges we face. As I said, this multiplying number of organizations makes the threat more difficult to manage, of course. So, because we need to deal with many more organizations than before. The challenge of radicalization, of course, remains one of the biggest problems we all face, and a lot of work needs to be done. There is particularly specific conditions in maybe every country or every society. Sir Geoffrey mentioned here the issue of immigrants, and I was telling them yesterday when we were discussing over dinner the example, the story I read in Reuters last October on a Syrian immigrant who managed to reach Germany after escaping east of Damascus, and he went to Cologne to pray in a particular mosque, and he was astonished to see that the preaching in this particular mosque was even a lot more rigid and fundamentalist and extreme than the one he left in east of Damascus. So it's not only that immigrants, as some are saying, that they bring with them extremism, it's actually they are affected by it sometimes in particular societies. So it's a difficult problem for all of us. And that's why building common grounds and dialogue and sharing of experiences without making the problem even more worse, that's the ultimate challenge for all of us. The third challenge, I think, is presented by sometimes apparently very different drivers for terrorism. Of course, the first one, I think, as we all agree, one way or another, is the challenge posed by the unprecedented development of communication technologies and what the internet have provided as a platform for extremist organization, terrorist organization, to promote their ideology. In the 70s and 80s, they didn't have this kind of tool. What they depended on was tape cassettes, pamphlets, some books, papers, and all of that, which was effective in many ways. But of course, what the internet is providing is much, much more different than that in terms of the scope and the outreach. The other challenge is, as I said earlier, that failed and fragile states provide a sort of a geographical counterpart to the virtual world of the internet. So in these kind of failed states and fragile states where we have conflicts, civil wars, and all of these sorts, it provides safe haven, it provides golden opportunities for terrorist organizations to grow, to plan their attacks and plan their operations and mobilize and train. Finally, in summing up, I just need to say that we need really urgently to overcome the challenges we face in countering terrorism, such as the lack of political will that sometimes hamper our collective efforts, lack of legal, administrative, and technical capacity and resources, the need for collective and concerted approach on countering the financing of terrorism, and maintaining the right balance between the freedom and rights of our citizens and security, and focusing on the short-term responses to urgent threats while maintaining the long-term perspective on preventing of radicalization. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you very much. Could I turn now to Jacopo Bellaccio? Mr. Bellaccio studied in Milan and in Scotland. He's an analyst at RAND Europe, focusing on defence and security issues, but in particular at the moment he is managing the Impact Europe project, which is a 3-year pan-European counter-violent radicalisation and extremism research effort. So we look forward to you telling us a bit about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's really a privilege to be presenting on this panel. As was mentioned, today I represent the Impact Europe projects and consortium. And if we go to the next slide, during this presentation, what I'll try to do is give you a bit of an overview of the context in which our project took place and what it tried to achieve. And then after quickly touching on the activities completed and the products and outputs that we've developed, I'll discuss a few lessons learned that still remain outstanding and need to be addressed from our perspective at a higher policy level. So moving on, Impact Europe stands for Innovative Methods and Procedures to Assess Counter-Violent Radicalization and Extremism. This was a project funded through the European Union FP7 program, and the mission that the partners and organizations that came together on this tried to achieve was really that of filling the gaps in knowledge and understanding of what works best and what is really effective at tackling violent radicalization and extremism. And moving on to the next slide, we can see that the idea behind this project came after realizing that at the time of putting together this proposal, our understanding of what was effective or what was at least promising practice in preventing or tackling violent radicalization and extremism was missing or was not really evidence-based. Furthermore, the practitioners and end users that are working in this space, although often very much enthusiastic and motivated, do not necessarily have a methodology that they can refer to understand whether their efforts are moving in the direction they're hoping for, and do not necessarily have the understanding of evaluation, practice, or capacity to do so. And these three key gaps in knowledge, moving to the next slide, shaped the key research questions that we set out to address, very much trying to contribute to the progressive and learning of this field through practice. And this took the shape, moving on to the next slide, of developing three key products. One being a database taking stock of the state-of-the-art of practice in tackling and preventing violent radicalization, as well as of methods and approaches used to evaluate whether this practice was effective or not. A methodology which took the shape of an online interactive evaluation toolkit, which practitioners can use to design and then perform evaluation of their work, but also get inspiration from the work done by other practitioners in the field and learn about both successful approaches, but also known pitfalls and known approaches that have proved to fail so as not to repeat the same mistakes. I think the sharing of shortfalls and pitfalls in this field is very much something we can all benefit from. And all these products are accompanied by a training course and manual, inclusive of train-the-trainer components, which really help to ensure that this tool can gain traction among end users and practitioners, and the broader community can benefit from this, not necessarily having to interact with the project team or the organizations that led this effort. So moving on and looking at the activities completed on again, as I mentioned at the start, this project was funded through FP7, so it's very much nearing its end now. It will continue until the end of June. So at this point in time, we're in a position where we've actually completed most of the work that we set out to accomplish. We've taken stock of what was available through publications and also surveyed in 2014 PCVE initiatives across Europe. We've developed and field tested with a number of practitioners across Europe, the United States, and Australia our toolkit, and we are now in the process of refining both that and the supporting course and manual that we've developed to make sure that all the sort of perspectives and feedback that practitioners and end users have provided us are reflected in something that is as user-friendly as possible. And moving on to the next slide, while I do not wish to bore you during this presentation with the ins and outs of the toolkit, as well as on the next slides, the sources of information, one element which is on the next slide I do wish to draw your attention to is really the efforts that we've tried to make, on the next slide, to engage with practitioners and end users across the tactical, operational, and strategic level, and to really embed their perspectives and suggestions on what was most needed in the toolkit and what sort of approach to presented required information evaluation would be most beneficial to them to ensure that this toolkit really gained traction among those that are then frontline workers or are then putting the day-to-day work that really aims at preventing and tackling this phenomenon. Moving on, again, as I mentioned, the project is now reaching its concluding stage. We're synthesizing the knowledge and lessons learned that we've gathered during these 3.5 years, and we'll be presenting this bit of shameless self-promotion at a conference later this month here in Brussels. But if we move to the next two slides, there are some elements that we can already discuss and touch upon during this presentation. And in particular, while we do feel that our project made some contributions to the advancement of the PCV field and to the advancement of evaluation practice in this space, in particular providing a proof of validation concept about the need to develop a PCV-specific focus for both interventions but also evaluations. Moving on to the next slides, there are still a number of challenges that do need addressing from our perspective. And first and foremost, one of the things we've witnessed across these 3 years is that really evidence base is still very scarce in the field of preventing and tackling violent radicalization and extremism. There's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence. Evaluation often take the form of ex-post expert assessments, but in terms of robust scientific evaluation, very little is still being done, and more efforts need to be made to ensure that this becomes something more systematic and that happens not only on a sort of project base, but more at a systemic level. There are, however, still several challenges that are preventing a more widespread adoption of evaluation practice in this field, in particular in terms of national markets at EU member states level being either very limited or missing the capacity both within the private sector but also within governmental departments to take more action. And more at the tactical level, there are also challenges in the sense of missing methodological instruments that have been fine-tuned and focused through practice for evaluating PCV initiatives. And while we've made an effort in this sense to try and tailor existing evaluation methods and practice to the needs of practitioners tackling and preventing violent extremism, only with the undertaking of more evaluations and the gathering of more comparable data that can inform us about what works and what doesn't, both at the level of interventions and at the level of evaluations, we can really make progress in this space. And then, of course, there's also an issue of this being clearly a very dynamic and, in this moment, high-pressure field where we do not necessarily have the enough space and time to allow for a proper feedback loop to take place and inform the practice that is ongoing, although this is clearly a catch-22 situation in the sense that the more resources are poured into this field because of the high demand for taking action, the more we should actually make an effort to better embed evaluation, and which lead me to the last point on this slide, being that of budget constraints, which is a bit of a surprise to find, but it's very much something we heard a lot from practitioners in the sense of budgets are focusing primarily on interventions and not enough resources are being earmarked or dedicated to ensure that evaluation takes place. And evaluation is often left as almost an afterthought, only after an intervention or a program has been completed or taken place, therefore also limiting our ability to collect the necessary data to make an informed appraisal of the work that has been done. A last point as a researcher also that I would like to draw is the issue of transferability and applicability of lessons learned and research that has been made in comparable or related fields, such as that of criminology or those of social movement studies. I think there seems to be a bit of a tendency to perhaps exceptionalize the issue of radicalization and violent extremism, whereas we could probably benefit and learn lessons as low-hanging fruits from fields that have faced similar challenges and issues in the past. And referring it to the efforts that we've done in our project, for example, gangs resistance literature provides several insights into methodological practice that can be used to evaluate programs with subjects that are clearly challenging to engage with from an ethical perspective, but also from purely a data collection perspective. So that was all I had. I hope to be taking questions either during the Q&A or offline. Thank you very much.
Jacopo, thank you very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, in this panel we have one final speaker. As you all know, the United Kingdom not only has a very intense terrorist threat, but historically, of course, the United Kingdom has highly professional and very competent police and security agencies, perhaps unrivaled in Europe. And so I'm delighted that we have Sonia Farry this morning with us. She's from the British Embassy in Brussels, where she is the head of the Counter-Terrorism and Extremism Network. So, Sonia, perhaps you could just say a word or two about the UK approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'll just briefly outline our approach to contest, our counter-terrorism strategy, and particularly focus on prevent. So the aim of contest is to reduce the risk to the UK and its interests overseas from terrorism, so people can go about their lives freely and with confidence. And we have four main strands, which many of you will have heard of before. Firstly, pursue, to stop terrorist attacks. Second, prevent, to safeguard people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. Then protect, which is about strengthening our protection against a terrorist attack. And finally, prepare, which is about mitigating the impact of an attack should it happen. So just focusing on prevent, that's about stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. And we see prevent as about safeguarding vulnerable people from being drawn into terrorism. In the same way that people were vulnerable to other issues such as gang violence or sexual exploitation. It's also about building community resilience to challenge extremist and terrorist ideology. And I should say it's about all forms of terrorism, far right as well as Islamist extremism. Prevent does not operate in the criminal space, and it's not concerned with matters of faith, but issues of extremist ideology. There are three main strands to the Prevent programme. Firstly, rehabilitation for those who are already engaged in terrorism, to disengage and to rehabilitate. Secondly, early intervention for those who are at risk of radicalisation. That's safeguarding vulnerable people, working with health, education and the police, so the kind of full spectrum approach that others have talked about. And then finally, building resilience in communities by addressing risk factors, and that's through partnerships with communities, civil society groups, public sector institutions and industry. I'll just focus on a few elements related to all of that. So firstly, to help build resilience in communities, we've supported community groups to deliver counter-narrative campaigns and have reached millions of people online since 2014. And we have 130 community projects which have reached about 20,000 people in the last year. There's also something called the Prevent Duty. So the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015 places a legal duty on schools, colleges, universities, local government, health trusts, police, prison and probation to have a due regard to the need to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. So this requires institutions to understand the threat as it applies to them, to ensure staff have the right level of training to be able to identify extremism, to work in partnership with others, and to, where appropriate, protect the public through policies on IT, extremist speakers, and welfare support, and also to promote freedom of speech. And we've provided all these sectors with bespoke guidance and have trained over 800,000 frontline workers to be able to spot signs of radicalisation, including through, for example, e-learning and other training. And then finally, penultimate was about building resilience online, which I know others have talked about, and we've worked very hard to, we have a unit which identifies extremist material, and then we work with social media companies to remove pieces of illegal terrorist material, and we've removed 250,000 pieces since February 2010, but clearly the scale of the problem is enormous, and we're working with social media companies to try to do more in that space, which you'll have seen references to that in the media. So the final area I want to talk about was the Channel Programme, which is a voluntary and confidential support programme for individuals who are at risk of radicalisation. It's not a criminal sanction. It's about giving people early intervention and support to divert them from potential future engagement. in terrorism, and it works alongside other safeguarding mechanisms for gangs, drugs, sexual exploitation. And it's an assessment about giving people the support they need, and that might include ideological mentoring, careers advice, mental health, skills training, employment, or other issues. About 1,000 people have received support through the child programme, and the vast majority of those individuals exit the programme presenting no further terrorist-related concern. I should say, in the context of this discussion, that 25% of those cases are for far-right extremism. And then the final point is to say, of course, we're also looking at how to do rehabilitation programs for people who have engaged in extremist or terrorist activity, including those who have been convicted. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Sonia, thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a range of speakers here in this first panel this morning, and we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. Maybe I could just start the ball rolling with Gilles de Kerchove. You mentioned early on about the very active Salafi organisations and that. Why can't we clamp down on them? Why? It seems to be, it stands out as a factor that there are maybe certain mosques, certain imams who are spreading extremism. We've seen how many terrorists have their contagion comes from being in a certain place and meeting certain individuals. Why can't we be more robust in dealing with these Salafist organizations, clamping down perhaps on foreign funding, foreign imams? What's your view on that?
I think we do. It's just that we haven't done that for some time. And I think when I see what some member states are now doing, they are much more aggressive than they were before, because they realize that they've been a bit too slow or too soft, because they were afraid to, let's say, have too much impact on what we have to protect as well, other freedoms, free speech, freedom of religion, and this we know is very sensitive, difficult balance to strike. And so, let's be honest, we've addressed the issue of foreign terrorist fighting much too late. We let thousands of our kids going abroad, and then, of course, no, we have taken all the measures. It's very difficult to go to Syria and Iraq. On the mosque, I see more and more action taken in Belgium, in France, expulsion of radical imams, and so on. On internet, the same. We have started a pretty good work to crack down on and to engage in a dialogue with internet companies so that we remove more unlawful content. We have copied the British system of internet referral unit. We create one at Europol. But it's a drop in the ocean. So the discussion now with the companies, can we not move to more automatic detection? Because it's not about 10,000 websites, it's about 100,000, if not millions, of unlawful content. But we know how difficult it is to delineate. But the consensus has now changed and is much more, I think, strong than it was before. And even on the ideology, I think I shared at the request of Commissioner King the other day a high-level brainstorming with the member states on evaluation of our city policy and what more needs to be done. I think there was a growing consensus to address the ideological aspect as well. People are a bit less afraid than they were before. So my answer is, I think we're on the right track. Probably we have been too soft for too long on that.
Thank you very much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have one question here. It's nice to see some of our colleagues, MEPs. Sorry, nice to see our fellow MEPs here. Please.
Right, good morning, Geoffrey. Thank you very much for organising a discussion on something that's very, very important. I've got three quick questions. One is to you. You used the term salvation and ancestry, I think, which is something I'm not familiar with. Maybe I just misheard you. Salvation and ancestry. Right, I must have misheard that. Okay.
Me or?
Yeah, it was from you.
Oh,
Yes.
Salafist?
Salvation.
Salafist?
Ah, right. Okay. Thank you. Right. The next question is about schools. The last speaker did touch on this, referring to education. And you, I think, talked about 5 specific boroughs in the country, 3 in London and 2 in Birmingham. I would like to think, and perhaps it can be confirmed, that we are really putting a big effort into putting individuals into these schools to try and stop the rot there, if you follow me. Are we doing that? And the third question is to our speaker from Egypt. Now, he cited an example of where somebody from east of Damascus went to a mosque in Germany and found that the preaching there was far more radical than anything he'd experienced in Syria. Now, I would say that this is incitement to violence and something should be done about that mosque. Was it? Thank you.
Of course, the questions you're putting, I'm not sure that the speakers we have here are equipped to deal with that, because in a way they're operational questions about what particular action. I mean, I think we know and we are understanding very well a lot of the action that needs to be taken. Now, the extent to which that is being taken, of course, is the big question mark. And we have heard from a number of speakers this morning already about problems over resources. I mean, I would, if you like, relate your question in a way to a sort of wider question over the sort of human rights issue. Because I think human rights is something which we all attach enormous importance to. It's what I call genuine human rights. I think sometimes human rights are exploited for the benefit of extremists, and sometimes on the response side we are reluctant to act because of fear about abusing human rights. And so I think there's a question among ourselves here, and I think we need to have an adult discussion among policymakers about this whole question of human rights and the interpretation of human rights legislation, the European Convention on Human Rights, its application, the Refugee Convention and its application. But there is a great reluctance to discuss these matters because inevitably there are vested interests where a ton of bricks will fall on people's heads as soon as they even mention these sorts of areas. But I do think this, I think what we're seeing is that there are so many factors at work, and we need to, our response needs to be multifaceted. But Gilles or other colleagues, I don't know whether anyone would like to comment on it.
A good example is free movement. Well, does not apply. The Schengen free movement doesn't apply in the UK, but on the continent. For some time, people were a bit reluctant to envisage amending the Schengen Code to foresee a systematic check of all EU citizens going abroad when they cross the external border, in and out. All Americans is checked against all US database when he re-enter the country. So it took a long period of time to convince the system that we should have that. And if we would have had that before, we would have spotted and stopped and prevent more young Europeans from going to Syria. Why was it so important? I remember I said that repeatedly. If we are not serious at the external border, people will want to establish internal border control. So we are trying to protect free movement by being more professional at the external border. Same on internet. If we are not more strict on those who abuse from free speech, we will end up with a much more tougher policy. So I like what you said, adult conversation. I think I'm probably the last one to be against fundamental rights. I spent 1 year of my life drafting the Charter of Fundamental Rights. I myself wrote Articles 7, 8, and 11 of the Charter. But when I see the endless debate we had in this house on PNR, yes, but at a certain stage you have to be adult. And there is a growing concern on security. Not just that we have to completely unbalance, but adjust, while and mainly to preserve freedom. I think no, it's a bit more adult. The conversation is more adult.
Well, I'm not aware of whether the German authorities are taking action or it's not. The example I was trying to give, the lesson out of it, is that, first of all, that immigrants are not necessarily bringing with them the radicalization or the threat. Sometimes they find it in Europe itself or in the West. What I would like to point out is that this example really gives us or sheds light on a problem that we have seen through the last probably 30, 40 years, growing in Europe. And this relates to the network that has been established by certain ideological and political Islamist groups, making use of course, the freedom that is, the space of freedom that is provided in Europe to establish and enforce, to establish their presence and gradually enforce their vision on Muslim communities throughout Europe. So they have succeeded because they are not your typical activists. They have a plan, they work according to certain strategic priorities, and so they have succeeded in, I have to admit, in establishing themselves as first the interlocutors between governments in Europe and the Muslim communities. They have done that in several major countries throughout Europe. So when you want to talk to the Muslim community in the UK or in France or Germany, you have to speak through them. And this is very dangerous because it has been proven in certain incidents that, first of all, they are not the mainstream by any means. Second, they are politically and ideologically motivated. So they're not only an advocacy for Muslim rights or whatever, but there's a political and ideological package to their advocacy and work and activities. We need to think of how to deal with that. I mean, it's your problem, definitely, but in the Middle East, we see implications of this growing situation in Europe. So it's a big topic to debate now, but we can certainly talk about it outside the panel. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yes, gentleman from back.
Really fascinating, actually, speeches from everybody here. I was really quite amazed, though, to hear from Gilles about this endless debate. I mean, it has been in the post for over a decade. We have been talking about anti-radicalisation and terrorism for a long time. And who does he feel needs to kick up the bum here at EU level or at national level? Who needs to push? Is it, and which policymakers? Is it European national governments? Is it institutions? Is it security services? And the second question is, very interested with a lot of what you said, and also with Cedric Smith and yourself, Mr. Azmi, about how things are changing. So we used to have intelligence services, and there was a particular enemy, or we thought there was an enemy, and we even knew what they looked like. And we say, there's the baddies, and this is how we deal with them. And we make weapons of some shape or form. But we're looking here more at social issues. There's a lot of talk here about the homegrown terrorism here. So how do you link the military and police aspects of security and intelligence with social services? For instance, he's not here today, but the Mayor of Mechelen, I believe, puts forward a lot of interesting proposals to tackle anti-radicalisation here in Belgium by sports clubs, by some form of integration. So it'll be interesting to hear what you think about me. Sorry, a bit long-winded.
I don't know if I got the question right, but between the EU and the member states, let's be honest, in the field of security, even after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, member states remain dominant. It's 90% member states, 10% European Union. We do our best to support member states. We don't pretend that we will replace member states. On the contrary, we want them to be more effective. So we try to mobilize money to invest in studies like Impact, by the way, FP7, EU money, to try to develop methodology, evaluation process, and have discussion. But at the end of the day, it's in the street of Molenbeek by the local authorities, it's by the security service in the UK, it's by all the players in the member states. We're just a small institution, a small player in the game. But what is interesting, we see more and more people asking more Europe. Not everywhere. We'll see on Sunday the outcome of the election in France. But 82% of the people in the polls, in the Eurobarometer, ask for more Europe in the field of security. And we try our best to scale up and speed up our investment. But in the first place, something which has to happen in the member states. And it's a long process before you, first because it's a tricky subject. After 10 years, I'm humble enough to say I don't still understand the process for radicalization. There are so many different profiles, so many drivers and so on. We all have to acknowledge it's a very difficult process. We see some features, and that's why, as I said, be a bit simplistic, I said let's work on the three main set of, you have to, the question is the weight for each individual. But what I'm convinced, more disengagement program, it's not the EU, Commissioner Jourova earmark money in the EU budget to help member states to design disengagement program in prison. How many member states have a disengagement program in prison which is effective? Tell me. The money is available and we have a network of 2,000 experts ready to help. Why is it that not more member states are doing? It's not the EU, it's not Brussels here. So,
just on the, if I may say, just on the latter part of your question, if you go back some years, you take, say, the British security services, they would focus on counter-espionage, counter-subversion, and then increasingly on counter-terrorism. And the counter-subversion bit rather disappeared. And I would suggest really what we're dealing with here is a form of subversion. And so under a new name, if you like, we're going to have to deal with this particular problem. So there was a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Michel de Rosen. I'm French and I chair the board of Eutelsat, a global satellite operator. If I may, I have three quick questions. To whoever on the panel is willing to answer. The first question is it fair to use the words radicalism, extremism, terrorism? Is it they were the same facets of, different facets of the same phenomenon? In other words, is it conceivable that some people become radical without falling into terrorism? Is my first question. My second question is, you European leaders, do you observe what's happening in other countries outside the European Union on how to fight terrorism and how to find the right antidotes? Do you find countries that are best in class, if I can use these words? And third question, do we use enough clerics, Muslim clerics from Europe or from other countries to speak to Muslims and tell them that that Islam is not a violent religion? If it's said by us, it's it's not worth much. If it's said by clerics, it could be much more meaningful.
The last point you make will be dealt with, I think, by our next panel. So if you don't mind, we'll leave that one. But if I could turn to Gilles to give us...
Yeah, in telegraphic terms, I'm sorry that I have to leave, but the first, yeah, you're right, we have to be cautious in the words we use. It's not that bad to be radical. What is bad is to use violence to push your ideas. So we used to refer to violent extremism, which is the one we want to address. So that would be the first. Other models, yes, we try to do that. For instance, let me just mention two countries from which we can learn a lot. Indonesia, where they have a very interesting, it's the largest Muslim country nearly in the world, and they have managed to avoid a lot of extremism through different means. And Algeria. The Algerians lost between 100,000 and 200,000 of their citizens. It's one of the worst civil war recently linked to that sort of phenomenon. And they have designed interesting mechanism for getting out of this ugly black decade. And third, clerics, yes, we need to do that more. I see some of our member states have even changed their policy recently, if you take France, to encourage the training of imams in Europe, to have them in citizenship program, to support them, and with the difficulty, for instance, in France, that you have a strict division between the state and the religion. In Belgium, for instance, the Belgian state pays the salary of the pastor, the priest, the rabbin and the imams, and therefore we have a discussion with all the religion on how do you improve the quality of the knowledge, because that is the problem at the end, because radical Islam is based on a non-sufficiently sophisticated interpretation and lack of knowledge and lack of quality. So the quality test for me is very important. So opening more Islamic studies faculties in university, giving incentive to clerics to go there and just improve, because what is missing in my reading is lack of discussion, lack of enrich interpretation, diverse, many interpretations of the same text. It's a more vivid and lively understanding of a text which is from the 8th century and needs to be contextualized.
Yes, then on your behalf, may I say a big thank you to Gilles de Kerchove. Thank you so much. I think just on your last point very briefly, it is a question of at what point does the state intervene on that spectrum from radicalism, extremism, terrorist action. Now, typically, of course, the state intervenes when someone carries out a criminal act. We've heard that from a number of our contributors. But then so often when you read about someone who's arrested, the headline in the newspaper is, the authorities knew about this person. And then the general public turn around and say, well, why wasn't something done about them? So it does beg that very difficult question, at what point do you intervene? And I would put on the table really the question, I'm not sure what the answer to this is, should there be, what preventive measures might one robustly take? In other words, do we have sufficient thoughts about preventive detention, for example? But there are historical precedents which haven't necessarily been good ones for that. So there's one other quick question, and then we need to break, and then I think we're going to have to stop. Otherwise, people need a cup of coffee, I think. Need 10 minutes, and then we'll have the next panel. But there's a final question here.
Well, I'm the UAE's ambassador to Brussels, and actually I don't have a question. I have just a couple of quick comments.
Yes.
First, I'd like to thank MEP Van Orden and all the MEPs who took a part in organising this, and as well as the International Organisation to Preserve Human Rights. It really is, I think, the ideology conversation where a lot more work needs to happen, because that is the long game. The police, security, military, intelligence are all necessary, but they are when we're already too late. And it's really here that there are a number of adult conversations that need to be had, whether it's on the difficulties between freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and then incitement and sectarianism on the other hand, whether it's on Islam. And in Islam, I think we don't have a problem saying that obviously terrorism is not unique to Islam. But at the same time, we have to say that I have no difficulty saying that Islam has been taken hostage by a minority, by a very small group of radical groups and radical clerics, and that we need to have this conversation about how to address this. And it's not a conversation that we just have in our region. It's one that also has to happen here. And what was said earlier on by Gilles on the concept of European Islam, which I also agree, perhaps we need another name for it, but it is the diversity within Islam. And I think there's a lot more that we can do to amplify moderate voices that speak to this diversity. The way that Islam is practiced in Morocco and the UAE and Indonesia vary, and no one has the right to come and say, I'm the one that knows the right Islam, and the one that you're practicing in Indonesia or in Algeria isn't the right Islam. So I think there's a lot there that we would like to see happen, and I'm glad to see a representative from Egypt here. I think that Al-Azhar Institute, a moderate institution that probably can do a lot to help on training of imams and addressing radicalization within mosques. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much. And in fact, you provide, I think, a very good lead into the second panel, which we'll have in about 15 minutes' time. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break there. May I, on your behalf, thank all the speakers in this first panel, and I look forward to your participation in our next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.